They laughed when I carried my own chair into the banquet hall until I unveiled the name on the invitation. Every eye in that glittering room turned toward me, smirks spreading, whispers rising like static. They thought I was desperate, pathetic, out of place. But the truth I carried in my pocket was heavier than their laughter, stronger than their pride. And before the night was over, that truth would silence them all. To understand why I refused to stand, you need to know what kind of room I was walking into. The banquet hall rose before me like a palace of glass and gold. The doors were carved mahogany, tall enough to make a person feel small before they even stepped inside. Beyond them, crystal chandeliers spilled light like falling stars, scattering across the polished marble floors. Every table gleamed with silver cutlery and porcelain plates, so delicate they looked like they belonged behind museum glass. Napkins weren't folded, they were sculpted intricate swans and lilies, perched at each setting as if even fabric had to earn its place here. This wasn't just a room, it was a performance. A stage designed to remind anyone who wasn't born into wealth that they didn't belong. And me? I walked into it, carrying my own chair. The weight of it dug into my palms, but it wasn't the physical strain that made me falter. It was the eyes, dozens of them. The sudden hush that swept across the hall as I crossed the threshold. Waiters froze mid-step, balancing trays of champagne like statues caught in the wrong scene. Guests turned their heads, their jewels catching the light as they leaned toward each other. Lips curled into smirks. Whispers rippled like static. The usher saw me first, tall, rigid, his black suit pressed so sharp it could cut. He stepped forward with the authority of someone who believed a clipboard and a velvet rope made him king. His voice was smooth, rehearsed, and dipped in condescension. "I'm sorry, miss," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "but all the seats are already reserved." There it was, the line meant to stop me cold. The kind of sentence that tells you not just that you're excluded, but that you were foolish to even try. And it worked. For a heartbeat, my body screamed at me to turn around, to spare myself the humiliation, to escape the spotlight of their ridicule. My chair felt heavier with every breath, as though it too knew I was out of place. But then I remembered why I was there, why I had carried this chair across the city, why I had dressed myself in courage instead of silk, why walking away wasn't an option. So instead of retreating, I stepped forward. That's when the laughter began. At first, it was a low hum, like the sound of bees gathering in the distance. Then it swelled chuckles, muffled giggles, sharp bursts of amusement that spread like wildfire across the hall. A man in a tailored navy suit leaned toward his companion and said something under his breath, and the two of them laughed openly. A woman in diamonds pressed a hand to her lips, her eyes sparkling with cruel delight. They weren't even trying to hide it. The sound of my chair scraping across the marble floor cut through their laughter, a jarring shriek that made even the chandeliers tremble. Every drag echoed, bouncing off the glass walls, announcing my presence in a language none of them could ignore. I reached an empty space near one of the long banquet tables. My fingers trembled as I set the chair down, but I forced my face to remain stone. I pulled the chair out, slowly, deliberately, and sat. My back is straight, my chin lifted. My heart was racing so hard, I thought they could see it thundering through my chest. I didn't beg them for a seat. I didn't ask for permission. I had brought my own, and that act, the simple defiance of it, sent the banquet hall into chaos. The laughter grew louder, sharper, like glass breaking all around me. Each chuckle was a blade, each smirk a wound. I could feel their ridicule crawling up my skin, searing me with shame. But I stayed still. I did not flinch. I did not rise. I sat there as though that chair had been carved for me, as though I had every right to claim that space. And deep inside, beneath the humiliation and the heat in my cheeks, I held on to a truth none of them could see. Because that chair wasn't just wood and metal. It wasn't just a desperate gesture from someone who didn't belong. That chair was a promise. And it wasn't mine alone, it was one my father had made years ago, long before this night ever existed. But that chair wasn't just furniture, it was a vow my father left me, and one I intended to keep. When I was a child, my father taught me something that sounded strange at the time, almost silly. We were sitting outside the factory where he worked, his hands stained with grease, his boots scuffed from 12 hours on concrete floors. The sun was setting, throwing long shadows across the parking lot, and I was eating the sandwich he had saved half of for me. He had just been passed over for a promotion again, the kind of chance he deserved but never got. I asked him why he wasn't angry. Why wasn't he fighting back? Why was he letting people who didn't work half as hard as him take the seats that should have been his? He looked at me for a long moment, then leaned back against the curb, his voice low and steady. "Never beg for a chair at someone else's table," he said. "Bring your own." I didn't understand what he meant back then. I was too young, too impatient, and too desperate to believe that the world could ever be that simple. But he repeated it often enough that it sank into me. It became a rhythm, a warning, and eventually a rule. I started noticing the tables in my own world, the ones I wasn't invited to. At school, the cafeteria was divided into kingdoms. The athletes had their long table in the middle, always loud, always confident. The rich kids claimed another, flashing their expensive sneakers and laughing as though they owned the air itself. Then there were the kids like me, floating from place to place, trays in our hands like burdens. I can still remember the sting of standing there, food cooling on my plate, waiting for someone to wave me over. More often than not, no one did. One morning, after seeing me come home the day before with untouched food, my father strapped a folding stool to my backpack. It was small, metal, and ugly, with peeling paint and a squeak that sounded like a scream when you opened it. I remember blushing furiously as he adjusted the straps, thinking, "Please don't make me actually use this." He crouched down, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "If they don't let you sit, don't you dare starve. Don't you stand there pretending you're fine. Make your own seat. Eat." I didn't have the courage to unfold it that first day. I carried it around like a secret shame, praying no one would notice, but knowing it was there changed me. It was proof that I didn't have to wait for permission to belong. And eventually, one day when the laughter and whispers got too sharp, I did it. I unfolded the stool right there in the cafeteria, sat down at the edge of the table, and ate. My hands were shaking, my cheeks burning, but I ate. Some kids laughed, some stared, but just a few shifted over to sit with me. That day, something inside me hardened. I realized my father hadn't just given me a stool. He had given me a choice, a way not to disappear. The rule followed me into adulthood. In job interviews, I sat across from people who skimmed Myersum with glazed eyes, their expressions already forming the word no. They asked questions designed to trip me up, dismissed my answers before I finished. Every time I walked out of those rooms, rejected again, my father's words echoed, bring your own chair. It meant don't wait for someone else to give you worth. Don't sit quietly in the shadows hoping for scraps. Don't let them measure you with rulers they designed to keep you small. That rule became my armor. It wasn't just a saying, it was survival. Because the truth is, people love to guard their tables. They love to decide who deserves a seat and who doesn't. And once they've decided you don't belong, they'll do everything they can to make sure you never forget it. My father knew that, he lived it, and he refused to pass that helplessness on to me. That's why the chair I carried into the banquet hall that night wasn't just wood and metal. It wasn't just a desperate gesture to save face in front of strangers. It was years of lessons carved into me. It was every cafeteria rejection, every job interview dismissal, every time I had been told with words or with silence that I didn't belong. So when the usher told me the seats were all taken, when the laughter rolled like thunder around me, when my cheeks burned with the sting of their cruelty, I didn't hear them as loudly as I heard him. My father's voice, steady, certain, almost protective. Don't beg, don't shrink, don't surrender, sit. And I did. I planted that chair on the marble floor as if it belonged there more than any of their golden place settings. I sat with my back straight and my chin high, even as humiliation burned me alive. They thought their laughter was breaking me, but they didn't know the truth. I had been preparing for that moment my whole life, and humiliation was waiting for me that night, led by a man who lived for my shame. The moment I lowered myself into that chair, the banquet hall exploded. At first, it was just a ripple, one or two. Chuckles, a smirk passed between neighboring guests, but then it spread, like a match catching dry leaves, until the entire room seemed to pulse with their amusement. The sound was sharp and merciless. It was laughter meant to include me. It was laughter designed to cut me out of the picture entirely. There is a special cruelty in being laughed at by people who already believe they are above you. Their laughter carried centuries of arrogance, the kind that assumes its right to judge is absolute. They didn't see me as a person in that moment. They saw me as a spectacle, a punchline in their carefully curated evening. I tried to steady my breathing, but it caught in my chest. My face burned, the heat crawling up my neck and ears until I thought I might burst into flames under their stares. My fingers trembled against the armrests of my chair, digging in until my nails ached. Every part of me screamed to run, to escape, to leave the chair where it was, and flee into the night, where at least the shadows would be kinder. But then I remembered my father. I remembered the cafeteria, the folding stool, the way he had told me that some people will never give you space, no matter how much you deserve it. If you want dignity, you have to claim it. You have to plant your feet or your chair and refuse to be moved. I had done it before, trembling though I was, and I could do it again. So I sat still, and in my stillness, I noticed the ringleader. Every crowd has one the spark that keeps the fire of cruelty alive. In this hall, it was Alec. Alec was the kind of man who walked into any room and immediately assumed it belonged to him. His suit wasn't just tailored, it was sculpted. His hair wasn't just styled, it was engineered. The diamond cufflinks at his wrists caught the light every time he lifted his glass, and he lifted it often. He wore his wealth like a crown and his arrogance like armor. He leaned back in his chair, surveying me the way a predator studies prey before the kill. Then, in a voice loud enough to carry across half the hall, he said, "Some people bring baggage to a party. She brought furniture." The laughter doubled. It thundered now, bouncing off crystal chandeliers. rattling through the hall like applause for his cruelty. People clutched their stomachs, wiping tears from their eyes, shaking their heads at the absurdity of me. One woman in a gown that shimmered like liquid gold covered her mouth and whispered, "Oh, Alec, you're terrible." But she was laughing harder than anyone else. Alec grinned at me, lifting his glass in mock salute. His eyes glinted with triumph, as if he believed he had already won. As if my humiliation was his entertainment, his reward, his proof that I could never sit at his table. My hands tightened against the chair, my body rigid, my pride screaming for me to fire back. To say something sharp, something that would cut through his laughter and wipe that smug look off his face. But I didn't, not yet, because anger burns fast, and tonight I needed something stronger. I had a weapon he didn't know about, so instead of snapping, I raised my chin. I met his stare head on, my silence louder than any words I could have spoken. For a brief flicker of a second, I saw something shift in his eyes' confusion, maybe even unease. Then he smirked again, covering it with another cruel jab. "Well," he said, swirling his champagne lazily, "I suppose every circus needs an act." More laughter, louder this time, emboldened by his lead. They thought he was clever, but cruelty isn't clever, it's cheap. Still, in that moment, they worshipped him for it. I pressed a hand lightly against my pocket, and the envelope inside pressed back. The paper was thick, the seal unbroken, the crest catching faint traces of the chandelier light whenever I shifted. It was a reminder of why I was here, why I couldn't afford to crumble now. Let them laugh, I thought. Let them pour their arrogance into the air until it choked them. Because when that envelope opened, their laughter would turn into silence. I sat taller, calmer now, letting their ridicule roll over me like waves against stone. They didn't know it, but every joke, every smirk, every sneer, they weren't breaking me, they were building me. With every laugh, they were winding the spring tighter, so that when it snapped, the sound of truth would shatter the hall. Alec thought he had humiliated me. He thought this was his victory. But the night hadn't even begun, because in my pocket I held something that would silence them all. My fingers brushed the edge of the envelope in my pocket, and in that moment it felt heavier than stone. Not because of its weight, it was just paper and wax, but because of what it carried. That envelope wasn't just an invitation, it was proof, it was history. It was a voice that had been silenced too long, waiting to speak again through me. The envelope was thick, made of ivory cardstock that seemed to glow under the chandelier light. Sealed with red wax, stamped with the crest of the very foundation hosting this event. It looked too official, too precise, too flawless to ever be mistaken for anything less than real. But I kept it hidden. I didn't place it on the table. I didn't flaunt it. Timing mattered. Around me, the laughter still simmered. Whispers flickered like flames through the crowd. I caught fragments. She must have forged it, probably printed at home. Some people will do anything for attention. Their voices stung, not because I believed them, but because it reminded me of every time in my life someone had questioned whether I belonged. And Alec, of course, couldn't resist adding fuel. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, eyes locked on me with a predator's grin. "Tell me," he drawled, his voice carrying just enough to make sure nearby tables heard. "Who exactly invited you? Or did you invite yourself?" The table erupted again, as if his words were scripture. Glasses clinked, people leaned closer, their eyes greedy for my answer. I felt the weight of the envelope press harder against my side. The truth sat right there, within reach, But I didn't take it out, not yet, because this was bigger than me. That envelope didn't just have my name on it. Inside, in carefully inked calligraphy, was a name that carried more weight than all the laughter in that hall combined. A name tied to sacrifice, to sweat, to brilliance, ignored by men who now sipped champagne under glowing chandeliers. A name they had erased from their speeches and their records, but one they couldn't erase from the truth. My father's name. The world saw him as an ordinary man, a worker, someone who fixed things and blended into the background. But what they didn't know, or what they chose to forget, was that he had built the very foundation of what they were celebrating tonight. His ideas, his designs, his work. Without him, this banquet wouldn't even exist. I tightened my grip on the chair, the urge to rip open the envelope, to shove it in Alec's smug face, to scream his name so loudly, the walls shook. It burned inside me like fire. But I held back, because if I gave them the truth too soon, it would be dismissed. Timing was everything. And patience, I reminded myself, was a weapon too. So I sat there, letting them stew in their arrogance, while the envelope remained untouched in my pocket. To them, it was a joke. To me, it was destiny. And when the moment came to reveal it, their laughter wouldn't just fade, it would choke in their throats. And the name inside wasn't mine alone, it was my father's, and it was about to change everything. My father never walked through doors like the ones I faced that night. He never stood beneath chandeliers that glowed like constellations, never sipped wine that cost more than his week's pay, never shook hands with men who wore power like a second skin. His world was different, smaller maybe, but in truth it was larger in meaning. His world was the hum of machines, the scratch of pencils against graph, paper, the quiet hours after midnight when the city slept, but his mind was awake, building worlds on paper. He was a maintenance foreman by day, but that title never captured who he really was. People saw him as a man who fixed things, leaky pipes, broken belts, machinery that coughed and groaned after years of neglect. But when the factory whistles stopped and the lights dimmed, he transformed. He became an architect of survival. He would sit at an old drafting table he'd salvaged from a storage room, its surface scarred and dented, and he would design. I used to sit beside him as a child, my legs too short to touch the floor, watching the way his hand moved. He drew like he was solving a puzzle only he could see. I remember leaning close, asking, "What are you making, Dad?" And he would smile softly, tapping the eraser against the paper. "A way out, kiddo. Always make sure people have a way out." At the time, I didn't understand. But later, when he showed me blueprints for reinforced stairwells, wider fire escapes, ventilation systems designed to clear smoke faster, I realized he was talking about safety. He was talking about lives. He saw the shortcuts, the greed, the places where companies skimped because cutting corners was cheaper than protecting workers. And he refused to look the other way. One night, I woke up to the sound of his voice carrying through the house. He was on the phone, explaining a new design he'd come up with to one of the executives. His tone was steady, respectful, but firm. "If you build it this way," he said, "you won't just save money, you'll save lives." I held my breath, listening from the hallway, convinced this was his moment. Surely they would listen. Surely they would see the value of what he had done. But they didn't. They dismissed him, told him he wasn't qualified to speak on design, that he should stick to repairs, that he was just a maintenance man. And though I was too young to fully grasp it, I could hear the weight in his silence as he hung up the phone. A few months later, I turned on the television and saw one of those same executives standing on a stage, unveiling a new innovation in safety. Behind him on the big screen were diagrams, my father's diagrams, the same curves, the same angles, the same ideas. But no mention of his name, no acknowledgement, nothing. They had stolen his work, polished it with their credentials, and paraded it as their own. I remember looking at my father, expecting him to rage, to smash the Waymo television, to fight back. But he didn't. He just turned it off and went back to his drafting table. He didn't need the spotlight. He didn't crave their applause. He only wanted people to live through the fires he knew were coming. And in time, his ideas did exactly that. Years later, when a fire broke out in one of the older plants, the new systems held. People got out. Lives were spared. Not because of the executives, not because of the men in suits, but because of him, because of a man who never got the credit he deserved. That banquet hall, the one I sat in with their laughter burning my ears, was built on the very innovations they had stolen from him. The banners on the walls flaunted diagrams that looked eerily familiar, lines I had watched my father trace on scrap paper at our kitchen table. They were celebrating the theft of his brilliance, sipping champagne beneath chandeliers bought with the profits of his silence. He had built the house, but he was never allowed to enter it, and now here I was, sitting in it. A daughter mocked, sneered at, dismissed, just as he had been. But unlike him, I wasn't silent. I had proof. I had the invitation, sealed and waiting. The chair I sat on wasn't just a shield against their laughter. The envelope in my pocket wasn't just paper. They were both extensions of him, of the man who raised me, the man who taught me not to beg for permission, the man who spent his life making invisible sacrifices for people who would never even say his name. And though they thought they were laughing at me, what they were really doing was laughing at his memory, at his refusal to play their game. But soon they would learn. Soon the name they had erased would echo through this hall so loudly it would rattle their champagne glasses. And when it did, they wouldn't be laughing anymore. Because with his death, my father left me more than memories, he left me instructions. When my father died, the world didn't stop. No headlines were written. No one outside our neighborhood mourned. There were no statues erected in his honor, no executives stepping forward to acknowledge the brilliance of the man they had used and discarded. He left this world the way he had lived in it quietly. And yet, for me, everything stopped. The air itself felt heavier. The house seemed too hollow, as if the walls had exhaled all at once and refused to breathe again. I spent the first days after his funeral wandering the rooms he had filled with life. His coat still hung by the door, the pockets weighted with loose change and folded receipts. His boots sat by the mat, streaked with the dust of 100 factory floors. On the kitchen table, his drafting tools lay lined up with the kind of neatness only he had, the pencils sharpened, the rulers stacked, the compass resting, as though he had just paused mid-design and would return any minute. But he didn't return, and the silence of that truth pressed on me until I thought I might collapse under it. It was on the third morning, when I could no longer stand the stillness, that I noticed the envelope, plain, brown, sitting on his desk as though it had been waiting all along. My name was written on the front in his careful, steady handwriting. No flourish, no decoration, just my name like a whisper, meant only for me. My hands trembled as I picked it up. I sat at his desk, the chair creaking beneath me, and tore it open. Inside was a folded letter and a smaller envelope sealed with red wax. I didn't touch the second envelope yet. My eyes went straight to the letter. "My girl," it began. I stopped there, my throat tightening. He had always called me that, never just Sarah or kiddo or sweetheart, but my girl, like I was his compass point, his pride. Seeing it in his handwriting made the room blur with tears, but I forced myself to keep reading. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone. I wish I had more time with you, but life doesn't always give us what we wish for. What it does give us are choices, and this letter is about choices." I swallowed hard, the words already cutting deeper than I thought they could. He wrote about his life, about how the world had a way of shutting its doors and pulling its chairs closer to keep men like him out. He told me not to waste time trying to convince people who had already decided my worth. "You will meet them," he warned, "the ones who smile while pushing you aside. The ones who laugh at your presence, not because you've done something foolish, but because they are afraid of being reminded that their power is borrowed. They will underestimate you because underestimation is how they survive." And then came the words that seared into me like fire. "When that day comes, don't argue, don't beg, don't shout. Simply show them the truth. And when you do, make sure you are seated. A person standing can be ignored. A person seated commands the room." I read that line over and over again, my fingers tracing the ink as though memorizing the shape of his wisdom. He knew what it meant to be ignored. He knew the humiliation of being erased, and yet, even in death, he wanted to give me a way to rise above it. At the bottom of the letter, he mentioned the smaller envelope. I picked it up then, turning it in my hands. It was heavier than it looked, sealed tightly in red wax, stamped with a symbol I didn't recognize. My name wasn't on it, only a single line in his handwriting across the back. "For the moment when the laughter is loudest." I pressed the envelope to my chest, the weight of it sinking into me. He was gone, but he had planned for this. He had known somehow that my life would bring me to a room where I would need it. A room where voices would rise against me, where ridicule would pour down like rain. And he had given me this an answer, a weapon, a shield. In that moment, sitting at his desk surrounded by the smell of graphite and machine oil, I felt him closer than I had at the funeral. He wasn't in the ground. He was here, in the letter, in the envelope, in the instructions he had left me. I didn't open it that day. I couldn't. My grief was too raw, my heart too broken. But I kept it safe, tucked away, carrying it with me through the months that followed, like a hidden piece of armor. And when I sat in that banquet hall years later, their laughter slashing at me from all sides, Alex smirking with his champagne glass in hand, I knew. This was the moment my father had spoken of. This was the battle worthy of breaking the seal. I slid my hand into my pocket and felt the envelope's edges beneath my fingertips. My father's words echoed in my head. "Don't waste it on small battles. Save it for when the laughter is loudest." The laughter was deafening, which meant it was time. Because when I broke that seal, the name inside was going to bring the entire hall to silence. The laughter eventually quieted. Not because they had grown tired of mocking me, but because the lights dimmed and the evening's program began. A hush fell across the hall, the kind of reverent silence that only wealth and spectacle can command. Waiters glided away with their trays, and all eyes turned toward the stage. A screen blinked to life at the front of the room, projecting bold golden letters. Celebration of Innovation in Public Safety. Alongside it, Tall banners unfurled from the ceiling, draping the walls in blueprints blown up larger than life. The crowd erupted into applause, polite but eager, their cheers rising with the clinking of champagne glasses. And then I saw them, the diagrams, the lines, the shapes. My breath caught, my chest tightening like someone had dropped a stone inside me. I knew those drawings. I had grown up with them. Those weren't anonymous designs or corporate property. They were my father's. His fingerprints lived in every curve of the fire escapes, in every careful crosshatch of ventilation lines. I could see the faint adjustments, the angles he had agonized over. I remembered him explaining one curve to me when I was 12, showing me how a sharper slope would slow the spread of flame, how a wider landing would keep panicked feet from trampling each other. Those banners weren't just diagrams. They were my father's handwriting, stretched across silk and hung as trophies. But his name, nowhere. Instead, a group of men in tuxedos walked across the stage, their smiles gleaming as bright as the lights overhead. They waved to the audience, bowed their heads with false modesty, and positioned themselves beneath the banners as though they had birthed them into being. The master of ceremonies, a man with a booming voice and perfect posture, raised his hands for quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "tonight we honor brilliance. Tonight we honor the visionaries who gave us these innovations, advancements that will protect countless lives for generations to come." Applause thundered through the hall again. I sat frozen, my nails biting into my palms beneath the tablecloth. My ears roared with the sound of clapping hands. My stomach twisted with nausea. They were calling thieves visionaries. They were toasting liars. And yet, the worst part was not their arrogance. It was the way the room believed them. People nodded, their faces glowing with admiration. Guests whispered in awe, raising their glasses to toast men who had never stayed awake until dawn over a drafting table, never torn up their sketches to begin again, never wept with exhaustion, but refused to give up because giving up might mean someone's life. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know that the man who deserved those toasts had died in silence, his designs swallowed whole by men who had the power to claim them as their own. The speeches continued. One executive strutted to the microphone, his words dripping with self-importance. He spoke about legacy, about building on the work of giants. I nearly laughed at the cruelty of it. Legacy. What kind of legacy is it when the giant's name is erased from the record? Every word was another theft, sharper than the last. Every boast felt like a hand clawing at my father's grave, stripping it bare. My body trembled with the effort it took not to scream. I wanted to leap up, to tear those banners from the walls, to expose them as liars right there and then. But I didn't, because my father's voice was still in my head. Don't waste it on small battles. Save it for when the laughter is loudest. So instead, I reached for my pocket. My fingers pressed against the envelope, its wax seal biting into my skin. It grounded me, reminded me that I wasn't powerless. I wasn't voiceless. I wasn't just the daughter of the man they had erased. I was the one carrying his name back into the light. And as I stared at the banners, I realized something that made my spine stiffen. They thought they had erased him, but they hadn't. The proof of his existence was staring every single one of them in the face. They just didn't know how to see it, because those designs, those curves, those angles, were more than technical drawings. They were my father's signature, invisible to anyone else, maybe, but not to me. I had grown up tracing those very lines with my small fingers, watching his hands guide the pencil, listening to him explain how every detail meant safety, survival, dignity. They had stolen his name, but the truth of his authorship was written in the language of design, a language only I understood. I clenched the envelope tighter, my jaw set, my heart pounding with rage and resolve. They thought the banners were their glory, but they were really his testimony. They thought their speeches buried him, but every word only revealed their theft more clearly. The irony was staggering. The very proof they thought exalted them was the same proof that would expose them. And when the seal broke, when my father's name was spoken aloud, this hall wouldn't just be quiet. It would collapse into silence. But before the silence could fall, Alec had to get one more laugh in. The speeches on stage ended with another swell of applause, glasses raised, and the triumphant clinking of silverware against crystal. The hall buzzed with self-satisfaction, a sea of men congratulating each other for carrying the weight of achievements they hadn't earned. It was almost enough to drown out the sting of earlier laughter until Alec's voice sliced clean through the noise, like a knife through silk. He didn't need a microphone. His words were calculated, projected just loudly enough to ripple through the room, to catch attention like bait cast into water. "Well," he said, lifting his glass in my direction with a theatrical flourish, "at least she brought her own chair. That's more than I expected." He paused, his smirk curling wider, savoring the moment like a man who knew the crowd belonged to him. "But let's be honest, how long do you think she'll keep it? 10 minutes? 15? I give it until dessert, before security carries both her and that chair right out the door. Who wants to place a wager?" The hall erupted. Laughter burst from throats eager for cruelty, echoing under the high-arched ceiling. Some guests pounded the table with their fists. Others nearly spilled their wine, too amused by the spectacle to care. Even those who didn't know my name leaned in, whispering with wide eyes and hungry smiles. I was no longer a guest at their banquet. I had become their entertainment, their evening sport. One man leaned across to another, murmuring, "She'll never make it past the toast." Another woman fanned herself dramatically and giggled, "I'll bet my pearls she doesn't last until dessert." Their laughter rolled like a wave, louder, sharper, crueler with each repetition. Alec leaned back in his chair, soaking in their approval. He swirled the wine in his glass as though he were conducting an orchestra, his smirk broadening each time the crowd roared. He didn't need to look at me. He knew his words had landed. He thought he had broken me, reduced me to the punchline he'd been dreaming of. Then, for the killing stroke, he leaned forward again, his eyes locking with mine. "Come now," he said, voice thick with mock sincerity. "It's nothing personal. Some of us were born to belong in a room like this. Others, well, they drag in their own furniture." The table howled with laughter again. The cruel cleverness of it, his words sharpened like blades, polished until they gleamed. He thought it was brilliance. He thought it was power. And for a moment I could feel the eyes of the entire banquet press down on me, smothering, suffocating. My skin prickled under the weight of their stares. Every instinct screamed at me to defend myself, to rise, to shout, to fight against the humiliation. But I didn't move. I sat perfectly still, my back straight, my chin lifted just slightly higher. My chair, the same one they mocked, was steady beneath me, grounding me in the storm. Because I wasn't here to win a laugh. I was here to end them. I slid my hand into my pocket, feeling the wax-sealed envelope press firmly against my palm. Its weight was steady, unshakable, a reminder of the truth waiting to be revealed. My father's words whispered through me like a heartbeat. Don't waste it on small battles. Save it for when the laughter is loudest. This was the moment. The laughter around me was deafening, the cruelest it had been all night. Faces gleamed with sweat and champagne, mouths open wide, teeth bared like wolves circling a lamb. They thought I was broken. They thought I was powerless. They thought I was the joke that would cap their night of glory. I turned my head and met Alec's eyes. His smirk was wide, triumphant, dripping with condescension. He was waiting for me to stammer, to flush red, to finally crack and confirm his victory. But instead, I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm, measured, deliberate. Every syllable carved itself into the air. "Stay," I said, my tone low but cutting for the names. The words hung there, heavier than any laugh. For a moment, Alec's smirk faltered, the faintest flicker of confusion breaking his mask. The people closest to us shifted uneasily, chuckling weakly, as though unsure whether to laugh again or fall silent. The laughter still rippled, but it no longer roared, it wavered, thin and nervous. I didn't explain myself. I didn't offer more. I simply leaned back, my hands folded neatly in my lap, and stared straight ahead. My calmness unsettled them more than any outburst could have, because predators don't know what to do when their prey refuses to run. And deep down, Alec must have felt it, to that crack of uncertainty, that whisper of dread that maybe, just maybe, he had underestimated me. The room didn't know it yet, but the master of ceremonies was minutes away from raising his voice and calling for the invitations. And when that moment came, the laughter would curdle into silence. Because soon, the hall would hear names, and mine wasn't the only one that mattered. The hall was restless now, a low hum running through the crowd like static before a storm. Silverware clinked faintly against china, chairs shifted, and conversations hushed as the master of ceremonies stepped forward. His shoes struck the polished stage with crisp, commanding clicks, each one echoing in the cavernous hall. The spotlight caught him in full, his tuxedo gleaming, his white gloves immaculate, his posture straight as a blade. He raised his hand, and the crowd obeyed as though on command. The laughter softened, the whispers dimmed, and every eye turned toward him. He waited, savoring the hush, stretching the silence until anticipation prickled against the skin of everyone present. Then he spoke, his voice resonant and trained, the kind of voice that filled theaters and courts alike. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone rolling with importance, "tonight is not only about celebration, it is about recognition. Innovation deserves credit. Vision demands acknowledgement. Each of you gathered here tonight carries not only the pride of attendance, but the honor of invitation." A murmur of agreement rippled across the room, and smug smiles appeared on powdered faces. The audience loved this, the spectacle of their names carried high on velvet air. It wasn't enough to be here. They craved the confirmation that everyone else knew they were chosen. And so the master of ceremonies continued, gesturing with precision toward the ushers stationed at the doors. "We shall honor those names one by one. Please present your invitations as you are called, and receive the acknowledgement due to you." Polite applause rose, sharp and quick, like the rustle of dry leaves. The first name was called, and a man in a tailored navy suit rose immediately, swelling with pride as though he had been waiting for this his entire life. He strode forward with theatrical confidence, handed over his card with a flourish, and stood tall as his name was repeated into the microphone. Applause followed, warm and affirming. He returned to his seat beaming, basking in the glow of recognition. The ritual repeated itself. Name after name, guest after guest. Women draped in silk glided forward, jewels glittering at their throats, lips fixed in gracious smiles. Men adjusted their cuffs, squared their shoulders, and carried themselves like kings stepping to their thrones. Each name was announced to cheers and nods, each envelope received with reverence, each returned to their seat marked by approving murmurs. It was theater, nothing more, nothing less, a play in which every guest was both actor and audience, drinking in their moment under the lights. And the deeper the performance went, the sharper the hunger in the room became. They longed for the next name, the next display, the next confirmation of their superiority. I sat still in the middle of it, my chair unmoving while the pageantry unfolded. My hands rested calmly on my lap, but my heart pounded a steady rhythm, loud enough in my ears that it seemed to echo like a drum. With each name called, with each round of applause, I felt the air around me tightening. It was building, rising, like a tide drawing back before a wave. Across the table, Alec leaned forward, his grin cutting into me like a blade. His eyes glittered with cruel delight, hungry for the scene he thought was coming. "I hope you've got a card tucked in there somewhere," he whispered, just loud enough for those around him to hear. "Wouldn't want you to embarrass yourself any more than you already have." Laughter rippled softly through the nearby guests, quiet but venomous, feeding off his lead. Alec sat back with smug ease, sipping his wine as though the matter were already settled. He had already decided my fate, but I didn't look at him. I didn't answer. My gaze stayed fixed on the stage, on the master of ceremonies, on the inevitable moment that grew closer with every syllable. My father's words beat against the inside of my skull like a second pulse. When the laughter is loudest, that is when you show them. Finally, the moment came. I heard my name, spoken clearly, formally, without hesitation. A ripple went through the room, this time not of admiration, but of mockery barely disguised. Heads turned as one, eyes sharp, hungry for spectacle. They knew this was the moment. The humiliation they had been promised all evening was about to be served. I rose. Slowly, deliberately, with no rush, no stumble, no falter. The legs of my chair scraped against the marble floor, the sound ringing sharp as steel against glass. The scrape cut through whispers, pulling eyes tighter to me. A silence heavier than applause settled across the hall. I began to walk. Each step was steady, the tap of my shoes echoing against the stone. My back was straight, my head lifted, and though the weight of their stares pressed like iron against my skin, I did not bow under it. Reaching into my pocket, I felt the envelope waiting. The wax seal was cool beneath my fingertips, the golden cardstock gleaming faintly, even in the dim light. I pulled it free, holding it between my fingers, letting the light catch it so the room could see. Gasps fluttered through the audience like startled birds. "It's fake," someone whispered. "She probably printed it at home," another hissed, earning a round of stifled laughter. "Desperate," a man muttered. "Pathetic." The laughter bubbled again, sharper now, growing, threatening to break into another wave. I heard it, but I didn't flinch. I reached the podium, my steps slow, measured, every second stretched into eternity. The master of ceremonies glanced at me, then at the envelope. His brows knit together slightly. He could sense the tension, feel the eyes on him, hear the whispers thickening in the air. His gloved hands hesitated above the podium, as though weighing whether to take what I offered. I lifted my chin, extended the envelope, and placed it firmly on the polished wood before him. My voice, when it came, was low but carried to every corner of the room. "Read it," I said. "Read it aloud." The hall seemed to exhale all at once, the laughter surging louder, mocking, gleeful. But my voice had already cut through them, and the seal gleamed in the light like the promise of thunder. Because I knew. When that wax cracked, the room itself would shatter. And when the seal broke and the name inside was spoken, every laugh in that hall would die mid-breath. The master of ceremonies stared at the envelope on the podium as if it were alive. His gloved hands hovered above the wax seal, uncertain, as though he could already sense the weight of what it contained. All night he had opened envelope after envelope, each one a formality, each one predictable. But this was different. He felt it. Everyone felt it. The air itself seemed to tighten, the hum of whispers sharpening into a razor's edge. At last, with a practiced flick of his hand, he pressed his thumb beneath the wax. The seal cracked with a faint but unmistakable snap. The sound was no louder than a twig breaking underfoot, yet it carried through the entire hall. It was as if the chandeliers themselves had paused to listen. Laughter died in throats, whispers froze on lips. For a moment, the only sound was the faint rustle of heavy paper being unfolded. The master of ceremonies glanced down at the card, his eyes scanning the inked words. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, first confusion, then disbelief, and finally something heavier, recognition. His lips parted, but no sound came. He looked up at me, his gaze darting from the page to my face, as if searching for confirmation that what he was holding was real. Then, gathering himself, he straightened his back, cleared his throat, and read aloud into the microphone. By express directive of Daniel Mirek, the name dropped into the hall like a thunderclap. Gasps tore through the audience. Sharp, involuntary intakes of breath filled the room, as though everyone had been struck at once. Glasses slipped from fingers, clattering against tables. A fork dropped onto a plate, the sound, unnaturally loud in the sudden hush. A woman at the far end of the room clapped a hand over her mouth. Another guest whispered something frantic, his voice trembling, but no one laughed. The name had silenced them. Daniel Mirek, my father, the man they had erased, the man whose designs hung on the walls like trophies stripped of their maker, the man who had died quietly, uncelebrated, while others feasted on his brilliance. And now his name echoed through the very hall, built on his work, carried across the airwaves by the microphone they had intended only for the powerful. It was as if the walls themselves leaned closer to hear. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on the arms of my chair. My heart hammered so violently in my chest that I thought the entire banquet must hear it. Yet outwardly I was calm. I did not smile, I did not cry. I simply sat rooted, while the name hung in the air like a storm cloud about to burst. On stage, the men who had strutted with pride moments earlier now shifted uncomfortably. Their smiles faltered, their polished masks cracked. One executive leaned toward another, whispering urgently. Another tugged at his collar as if the bow tie were suddenly strangling him. The glow of confidence had drained from their faces, leaving only pale panic in its place. The guests, too, were restless. Some glanced at me, their expressions caught between shock and shame. Others shook their heads, muttering to themselves, replaying the moment in disbelief. They had spent the evening laughing at me, mocking me, dismissing me. Now the truth unraveled their certainty, thread by thread. The master of ceremonies read on, his voice steadier now, but laced with awe. This guest attends tonight not by the courtesy of your invitation, but by the right of one written and sealed by Daniel Mirek himself. the man whose work forms the foundation of this event, the man whose innovations are displayed here tonight. The words boomed across the hall, impossible to ignore, impossible to laugh away. And in that instant, the balance of power shifted. I was no longer the spectacle. I was no longer the joke, the desperate outsider dragging her own chair. The room itself had redrawn around me. I was no longer sitting at the edge of their banquet. I was at its center, not because of who I was, but because of who my father had been and what he had left behind. The irony was breathtaking. They had gathered here to celebrate stolen brilliance, never imagining that the name of the man they had stolen from would rise from the silence and confront them. They had thought they had buried him, but his name was louder than their laughter, stronger than their denial, sharper than their arrogance. My father's name, Daniel Mirek. The name they had erased now blazed brighter than the chandeliers. The name they had hidden was now spoken into the record, broadcast across the room, etched into the memory of every person present. They could never take it back. Across the table, I caught Alec's face. The smirk that had seemed carved into stone was gone. His lips parted, his eyes wide, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and dread. He had expected a farce, a public collapse, my humiliation. Instead, he was witnessing something he couldn't comprehend. My victory, silent and absolute. The hall was silent except for the sound of breathing, sharp, shallow, uneven. Even the chandeliers seemed to hum more quietly, their light reflecting in the wide, stunned eyes of the crowd. And in that silence, I heard my father's voice as clearly as if he were beside me. Don't beg, don't shout, simply show them the truth. And I had. I sat taller in my chair, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of the name settle like dust over every person in that room. Because the truth had been spoken, and once spoken, it could never be unsaid. But the invitation carried more than just his name. It carried a condition, a clause that none of them expected, one that would change everything again. The master of ceremonies stood frozen, his posture stiff, his face pale beneath the glow of the chandelier. He had read my father's name, and it had already shaken the banquet hall to its core. But now his eyes lingered on the rest of the letter, and the longer he stared, the more unease spread across his face. His gloved hands tightened on the card until the heavy parchment curled slightly at the edges. The silence stretched painfully, like the pause before a storm. Guests shifted uneasily in their chairs. A cough rang out, loud in the stillness, followed by the nervous clink of a glass set too hard on the table. Whispers began again, sharp and hurried. "What's wrong?" someone muttered. "What else is written there?" another asked, their voice trembling with both dread and curiosity. The master of ceremonies inhaled slowly, as if trying to gather his composure. He was a man used to control, to being the voice of order at grand affairs like this one. But the words before him were undoing that control. Even he, the polished guardian of protocol, could feel the weight of what he was about to say. He cleared his throat, the sound amplified through the microphone, echoing through the hushed room. "The directive of Daniel Mirek," he began, his voice strained but steady, "comes with conditions." The words rippled through the crowd like a stone breaking the surface of still water. Faces turned, brows furrowed, lips tightened. Conditions. Invitations were meant to flatter, to honor, to gild reputations, never conditions. This was something new, something dangerous. The master's eyes scanned the lines again, and his voice grew stronger as he continued. This gathering, this banquet, this celebration, stands upon the work of Daniel Mirek. His designs, his innovations, his brilliance are displayed here tonight, stripped of his name, but not of his hand. Therefore, his presence, through this sealed invitation, was not granted lightly. It was granted on one condition: that credit be restored to him, publicly, immediately, without qualification or excuse. Gasps rang out like a chorus. A woman in pearls shook her head, whispering no as though the sound alone could undo the words. An older man muttered, unthinkable, under his breath, though his voice trembled. On the stage, the executives stiffened, their polished smiles crumbling. They had not expected this. They had thought themselves safe. But my father had planned far more carefully than they had ever imagined. Still, the master of ceremonies was not finished. His voice hardened as he read further. In addition, Daniel Mirek's directive demands that all financial gains derived from these designs must benefit those who risk their lives in the factories, the workers whose safety these innovations were meant to protect. A fund is to be established, permanent, and untouchable, ensuring that the profits earned are returned, not to shareholders, but to the men and women on the ground. The hall exploded into noise. Shouts cut across the air. "Impossible," one man bellowed. "This is outrageous," another roared, slamming his fist against the table, so hard the glasses rattled. A woman snapped, "He has no authority, he's dead." Her voice cracked, betraying her disbelief. On stage, the executives had descended into chaos. Their whispers were frantic, their gestures sharp and wild. One man gripped his pen so tightly it snapped in his hand, ink staining his cuff. Another shook his head violently, his lips curling into curses. I couldn't hear but could see. They had walked in expecting applause, glory, and control. Instead, they were prisoners of a dead man's will. The master of ceremonies raised his voice above the uproar, his words cutting through like steel. Failure to comply with these conditions will result in the immediate withdrawal of Daniel Mirek's endowment, secured through his estate, and the initiation of legal proceedings to challenge all current claims upon his work. The hall fell into silence once more. Endowment, estate, legal proceedings. These were not symbolic words. They were the bones of law, the steel of permanence. My father had not left this moment to chance. He had wrapped justice into his legacy, sealed it with foresight, and locked it with teeth that would bite deep if ignored. He had anticipated their greed, anticipated their theft, and he had left behind the perfect snare. The guests no longer looked at me with laughter or pity. Their eyes were wide, uncertain, and heavy with something close to fear. The men on stage were pale with panic, cornered, undone. And I sat tall in my chair, the envelope empty now in my lap, the silence heavy around me. My father's voice seemed to live in the air, echoing in the walls, humming through the chandeliers. When the laughter is loudest, that is when you show them. Now I understand. He had not just meant the moment of unveiling. He had meant this entire storm. He had waited for them to laugh, to grow smug, to believe themselves untouchable, because the higher their laughter rose, the harder their fall would crash. They had mocked me for bringing a chair. They had thought it desperate, pathetic. But my father had given me far more than a seat at their table. He had given me the power to turn their banquet into a reckoning. But even as the truth echoed through the hall, Alec's pride refused to die quietly, and I had one final answer waiting for him. The banquet hall was no longer a place of laughter and smug applause. It was a battlefield of silence, broken only by the shallow breathing of people who had been forced to confront the truth. My father's name had been spoken. His conditions had been read. The powerful men who once strutted in arrogance now sat exposed, their glory stripped bare. But not everyone was ready to accept defeat. Alec, from across the table, I saw him shifting in his seat, his pride boiling even as the weight of my father's letter pressed down on the room. His smirk had collapsed when the name was read, but now he was clawing for scraps of dignity, refusing to let the silence crown me. His voice, sharp and bitter, sliced into the air. "So that's it," he sneered, his tone dripping venom. "You think an old letter changes anything? You really believe that dragging your father's ghost into this hall makes you one of us?" The crowd stirred, uneasy. Some guests glanced at him with annoyance, others with relief that someone had dared to speak. They weren't brave enough to voice their disbelief, but Alec had always loved being the loudest in the room. His voice shook, but he forced it louder. "You came here with your chair, thinking you'd make a point," he spat. "All you've proven is that you don't belong. You'll never belong. This is our world, not yours. All you did was make a scene." His words hung in the air, bitter and desperate, but they couldn't undo what had already been revealed. The master of ceremonies still held the letter. The crowd still remembered the gasp when my father's name had thundered through the hall. Yet Alec's mockery clawed at the silence, trying to drag the room back to its old order, to the comfort of laughter at my expense. Slowly I rose from my chair. The legs scraped against the marble floor with a sound so sharp it sliced through his words. Every head turned toward me. I lifted the chair, the one they had mocked me for carrying into this hall, and I set it firmly on the table between us. The wood was heavy, its weight undeniable, its presence commanding. I stepped closer to Alec. His smirk wavered, but he held it, though his eyes betrayed the flicker of doubt. I placed my hand on the back of the chair and leaned toward him. My voice was calm, low, but carried to every ear in the room. "Feel it," I said. His eyes narrowed. "What?" "Feel it," I repeated, pressing the chair toward him. "That weight, that wood, that metal. That's what dignity costs. That's what it means not to beg for a seat at someone else's table, but to bring your own." The room was silent, every guest hanging on my words. Alec's hands hovered uncertainly. Then he gripped the chair as if to prove his strength. His knuckles whitened, but the weight dragged against him. He looked up at me, his smirk broken into a grimace. "You mocked me for carrying this chair," I said, my voice firm. "You laughed with them when I placed it here, as if it was a sign of weakness. But tonight, this chair was more than wood and iron. It was a promise my father gave me, a promise that no matter how loud the eon laughter, truth will always outlast it." I let go of the chair. Alec staggered slightly under its weight before setting it down clumsily. His face was red, his confidence cracked. He looked around for support, but none came. The guests who had laughed with him now avoided his eyes. The executives who had once welcomed his mockery now sat paralyzed, too consumed by their own ruin to rescue him. I stepped back, my voice rising for the final time. They laughed when I brought my own chair. Tonight I leave it behind, so the next time they forget someone's name, they'll remember mine. The hall erupted, not in laughter, not in mockery, but in stunned silence so heavy it pressed against every chest. My words echoed in the marble, in the chandeliers, in their ears. And as I walked away, I left the chair standing there, not as a burden, but as a monument, a reminder that I had claimed my place not by invitation, not by mercy, but by right. The banquet hall had wanted me gone, erased, forgotten. But as I crossed its polished floor and pushed open its grand doors, I knew the truth had burned itself into its walls. They could not laugh it away. They could not bury it again. And somewhere, in the quiet of my heart, I heard my father's voice one last time. Stand tall, don't beg, show them I had. And the hall would never forget it.